The day I walked across that stage to grab my diploma, the one I'd bled 4 years for, the one I'd cried at 2 a.m. over, the one I'd earned while working 2 jobs and surviving on instant noodles and sheer stubbornness, I looked out into that crowd with this ridiculous, embarrassing hoax still sitting inside my chest. Even then, even after everything. And he wasn't there. And I think part of me already knew he wouldn't be. But knowing something and actually living it, those are two very different kinds of pain. My name is Lily Rose, and I am not someone who tells her story easily. I never have been. I was raised in a house where feelings were something you folded up small and tucked away, like old receipts you never looked at again. You didn't talk about what hurt. You just kept moving. You just kept being useful. You smiled at the right moments. You said the right things at the dinner table, and you made sure nobody ever felt uncomfortable because of you. That was the rule in our family. Unspoken, but iron. My father, his name is Gerald, though most people called him Gary, was the kind of man who filled a room the second he walked into it. Not because he was warm, though sometimes he could be, in small, unpredictable ways that made you crave them. He filled rooms because of his presence, his voice, the way he held himself like he'd already decided he was the most important person in any given space, and the world had simply agreed and arranged itself accordingly. Growing up, I worshipped him. I think most daughters do, at least for a while, before reality starts peeling back the edges of the story you've been told about who your parents are. I used to follow him around the yard on Saturday mornings when he'd do small repairs, fixing the fence, checking the gutters, oiling the garage door, and I'd hand him tools I didn't know the names of and feel like I was participating in something sacred. Like just being near him was a privilege. My brother, Daniel, was 5 years older than me, and he operated in my father's world in a way I never quite figured out how to. They spoke the same language: sports, business, opinions about things that mattered to men like Gary. They'd sit at the kitchen table after dinner and talk for hours about nothing that ever included me, and my mother would clear the dishes and I'd help her. And that was just how it was. Nobody questioned it. That was the arrangement. I was 14 when my parents split up. My mother, Carol, had been quietly unhappy for years in the way that very selfless people often are. Not dramatic about it, not demanding, just slowly going gray from the inside. My father had an affair. Not a secret one, not even a careful one. He was just careless about it in the way that men who've never really been held accountable for anything tend to be careless. Like consequences were a concept that applied to other people. When everything came out, my father moved 30 minutes away with the woman he'd been seeing. My mother stayed in the house with me. Daniel was already 19 by then, and technically living on his own, though he spent most of his time at Dad's new place. That told me everything I needed to know about whose side he'd landed on, though nobody in our family was ever crass enough to use that word. Sides. We just watched the geography of everyone's loyalty and understood. My mother never once said a bad word about my father in front of me. Not once. She'd press her lips together sometimes, especially in the early years, and I could see the effort it cost her. But she held the line. She was determined that I would have a relationship with my father if I wanted one, and she wasn't going to be the thing that stood in the way of that. I think about that a lot now. How much it must have cost her. My father, for his part, showed up the way divorced fathers often do. In bursts. Enthusiastically present for the big things. Inconsistently present for everything in between. He came to my school plays. He came to my high school graduation, although he showed up late and spent half the time talking to someone he knew in the parking lot. He took me to dinner on my birthdays. Always somewhere nice. Always somewhere he could be seen being a good father. He had opinions about my future. Loud ones. And he shared them the way he shared most things, as declarations, rather than conversations. He wanted me to study business. He thought that was the sensible path. Practical. Something with a real job at the end of it. Something that could translate into real money. Real stability. His words. Or at least with what passed for best intentions in his world. I wanted to study social work. That conversation did not go well. I remember sitting across from him at one of those birthday dinners. I was 17, and I just started seriously researching programs. And I told him what I was thinking, and there was this pause, this long, loaded pause where I watched him recalibrate his expression from something like surprise to something like careful disappointment. And then he said, very measured, very calm, that he hoped I knew what I was signing up for. That social work was admirable, sure, but it wasn't exactly a path to financial independence, that I should think carefully, that he wanted more for me than a career that would burn me out for poverty wages. He said it like he was giving me a gift, like honesty was the kindest thing he could offer. I nodded. I thanked him for his input, and then I went home and applied to every social work program within driving distance of my mother's house, because I knew, even at 17, I knew that his idea of more for me was really just more of what he understood. And he didn't understand me. He never really had. I got into my first choice school, full program, decent financial aid, enough scholarships that my mother and I could manage the rest between us without drowning. It wasn't easy. Those 4 years were not a movie montage. There were semesters where I worked 3 jobs and took 18 credit hours and survived on 4 hours of sleep and a frightening amount of coffee. There were clinical placements that wrecked me emotionally, in ways I still carry. There were moments where I sat in my car in parking lots and just breathed through the weight of all of it, trying to find the floor again. But I loved it. I genuinely, deeply loved it. The work meant something. Every placement, every case, every small moment where I could see that something I'd done had made a person feel less alone, it mattered. It was hard and exhausting and underpaid, and I would not have traded it for anything my father's version of success could have offered. My mother came to every single thing she could. Every parents' weekend. Every small ceremony. When I finished my first major clinical rotation and they had a little recognition event, she drove 45 minutes in the rain and sat in those folding chairs like it was Carnegie Hall. She cried. She always cried. And then she'd squeeze my hand and say something like, "I knew you'd be okay. I always knew." My father came to not many things. He had reasons, always reasons. Work was demanding, travel, things that came up. He'd send texts that said, "Proud of you," which I'm sure he meant in the abstract, general way that people mean things when they don't actually show up. I stopped expecting him. I made peace with it, or I told myself I had. My graduation was in May, late May, one of those warm evenings where the air smells like cut grass and possibility, where everything feels a little suspended, a little golden. It was a big deal, not just a bachelor's degree, but also the completion of my licensure practicum, which meant I was walking out of that ceremony with both my degree and my pathway to full licensure already in motion. 4 years of everything I had, 4 years of rebuilding myself around something that was entirely mine. I sent my father the invitation in February, plenty of time. I called him in March to confirm the date. He said, "Absolutely, I'll be there. Wouldn't miss it." I took him at his word. I don't know why I still did that, but I did. 2 weeks before graduation, he called me. I could tell from the first 3 seconds of that call that something was different. There was a slight distance in his voice, the particular kind that people use when they've already made a decision and they're just figuring out how to deliver it. He couldn't make it. There was a work thing, a conference, something he'd committed to months ago that he'd apparently forgotten about when he told me he'd be there, or maybe the dates shifted, or something. The details were a little blurry in his telling of it, and I stopped really listening somewhere in the middle, because I realized it didn't matter. The details didn't matter. What mattered was the pattern. What mattered was that this was the 5th or 6th or maybe the 8th time in my adult life that he had confirmed something and then unmade that confirmation at a distance close enough to hurt. I was very calm on the phone. I said I understood. I said it was okay. I said we'd celebrate another time. Then I hung up and sat in my apartment for a while. My mother called me that same evening. She'd heard from a cousin who'd heard from someone, the family grapevine, doing what it always does. And she asked me quietly if I was all right. And I said yes. And then I said, "Actually, no, not really." And she said, "I know, sweetheart, I know." And she didn't say anything about him, didn't editorialize, didn't say "I told you so," even though she had every right to. She just stayed on the phone with me. Graduation day came. My mother was in the front row in a new dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion. Yellow, because she said yellow was the color of watching something bloom. My 2 closest friends from my program were there. A professor I'd grown close to over 4 years came, which genuinely surprised me and meant more than I could articulate. My roommate from junior year made the drive from 2 hours away. My father was not there. I walked across that stage, and I heard my mother making the kind of noise that mothers make when something cracks them open with pride. And I held my diploma, and I smiled for the photos, and I was happy, genuinely happy. Because the people who mattered were there, because I'd done the thing, because no one's absence could undo what I had built. But the absence was still there. It's a strange thing, how you can be completely full and still feel a missing piece. How joy and grief can occupy the same moment without canceling each other out. The dinner after was wonderful. My mother had booked a table at a restaurant I'd mentioned once, months ago, and I don't know how she remembered, but she did. There were flowers on the table. There was a card that she'd had everyone in her apartment building sign, which I found out later she'd organized by going door to door. She gave a toast that made me cry. My friends gave a toast that made everyone laugh. It was exactly what a celebration should be. My father sent a text at 9:47 that evening that said, "Congrats, Lily. So proud. We'll celebrate soon." I read it. I put my phone face down on the table. I went back to my dinner. Daniel didn't reach out at all that day. Not a text, not a call, not anything. I noticed, but I filed it away. Daniel and I were not close in the way siblings in movies are close. We were cordial at family events, careful with each other in the way that people who share history but not much else tend to be careful. We'd settled into a comfortable distance years ago, and mostly stayed there. So when Daniel called me 6 weeks after graduation, I was already slightly on guard. Not dramatically so, just the low-level alertness that a lifetime of careful management instills in you. He called on a Sunday afternoon, and his voice had that particular tone, bright, almost too bright, the warmth turned up a notch past natural. We made small talk for maybe 3 minutes. He asked how the job was going. I'd started a position at a nonprofit that I was genuinely excited about. I told him it was good. It was really good, actually. He said, great, that's great. And then he shifted. He needed help. He and his girlfriend, Mara, they'd been together about 2 years, a woman I'd met exactly 3 times, were in a situation. They'd been planning to move, a new apartment, something bigger, better neighborhood, you know how it is. And there had been some unexpected expenses, some things that came up with the move, some costs they hadn't fully anticipated. He didn't get very specific about what those costs were, which I registered. And the number he landed on, after a few minutes of careful, cushioned build-up, was $8,000. $8,000. I want you to understand what $8,000 meant to me at that moment. I had been in my new job for 6 weeks. I was making a salary that was, by any honest measure, modest. Because social work salaries are, as my father had once helpfully pointed out, not exactly the path to financial independence. I had student loans. I had an apartment I was still setting up. I had savings that I had scraped together over years of working multiple jobs. And they were not nothing, but they were not enormous. And $8,000 was not a small piece of them. I asked him some questions, carefully, the way I'd learned to ask careful questions. What specifically were the expenses? Had he looked at other options, loans, credit, a payment plan with whatever he owed? Was there a timeline? Was he in some kind of trouble? Like real trouble? Something I should be concerned about beyond the money? His answers were vague, not evasive in a panicked way, more evasive in the way that people are evasive when they haven't fully thought through their own situation and they're hoping someone else's generosity will smooth over the parts they haven't figured out. He said it was just the cost of moving, of getting set up. He said he'd pay it back. Definitely, he just needed time. He said family helps each other, right? And there it was. Family helps each other. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about May. I thought about a yellow dress in the front row and a text at 9:47 that night. I thought about 4 years of building something entirely on my own, without much help from the side of the family that had always had more resources, more space, more ability to show up. I thought about the fact that Daniel had not sent me a single word on the day of my graduation. And then I said, very quietly, very evenly, "Daniel, I'm not able to do that." He was surprised. He'd expected, I don't know what he'd expected. Maybe a hesitation and then a yes. Maybe some negotiating down to a smaller number. He hadn't expected a clean, unhedged no. He tried again, a different angle. He reminded me that Dad wasn't going to help. Their relationship had apparently hit some kind of rough patch I wasn't aware of, and that he'd asked a couple of friends, and they couldn't swing it either. And I was kind of his last option here. I was the person he was coming to. I said, I hear that, and I'm sorry you're in a tight spot, but I'm not in a position to lend $8,000, and I'm not going to. There was a pause, and then his voice changed, not dramatically, not into something loud or cruel, but into something cooler, more disappointed than I'd expected, more injured, like I was the one who'd done something wrong here. He said he guessed he'd figure it out. He said he hadn't realized we were at the point where family wasn't family anymore. He said it the way people say things when they want you to feel the edge of it, without them having to be explicit. I said, I hope you find a solution, Daniel. I hope things work out. And I got off the phone. I won't pretend that conversation didn't shake me. It did. Not because I doubted my answer. I didn't, not even for a second. But because of the feeling underneath it. The particular kind of loneliness that comes from realizing, in a new and concrete way, the exact shape of what you don't have. The family that might have been. The brother who might have shown up in June and was now calling in August with his hand out and a speech about what family means. I called my mother that night. I told her what had happened. There was a long pause on her end. Not a judgmental one, just a processing one. And then she said, "You did the right thing." And she said it quietly, without drama, and it landed exactly the way I needed it to. She also said something else, something I've thought about many times since. She said, "You know, Lily, the hardest thing isn't saying no to people who've hurt you. The hardest thing is not feeling guilty about it. Those are two separate mountains to climb." She was right. She usually is. I spent the weeks after that in a strange kind of emotional limbo. The job was good, genuinely good. The work was meaningful, and my colleagues were people I respected, and the clients I was working with were people whose lives I cared about. That part of my world was solid. But the family part was quiet, in a way that felt pointed. My father didn't call. Daniel didn't call. I'd made a boundary, and the silence on the other side of it was informative. I wrote in my journal a lot during that time. I've kept a journal since I was 12, one of the habits I picked up from my mother, who has about 40 notebooks stacked in her closet dating back to the 80s. Writing has always been how I process things I can't talk through yet. How I find out what I actually think when I'm still too close to something to see it clearly. What I wrote, in the end, over many entries, was this. I was not the person who had failed this family. I had not been the one who walked out. I had not been the one who chose a conference over a graduation. I had not been the one who went months without making contact and then appeared with a handout and a lecture about family loyalty. I had kept showing up. I had kept being decent and careful and kind in all the small ways that don't get acknowledged. And I had finally said no to something. And the response had confirmed everything I needed to know about the transaction I'd been participating in. I was not obligated to finance someone else's life with money I had earned with my own hands, my own sleepless nights, my own years of sacrifice. Especially not someone who hadn't even picked up the phone to say congratulations on the day that I crossed a finish line I'd spent half a decade running toward. That felt important to say clearly, even just to myself, on paper, at 11 o'clock at night. About 2 months after the call with Daniel, my father reached out. A text, then a follow-up call when I responded briefly. He'd heard through the family network, my aunt, probably, that there'd been some tension between Daniel and me. He wanted to check in, see how I was doing. The call was strange. He was careful with me in a way that was unfamiliar. Not unkind, just tentative, like he was trying to find the right footing. He asked about the job. He asked about my apartment. He asked about my friends. Normal questions, reasonable questions. The kind of questions that would make someone observing the conversation think, oh, this is a father talking to his daughter. Everything is fine. And then, eventually, he brought up Daniel. Not in a direct way. Not, can you help your brother? Nothing so straightforward. More like, Daniel's having a hard time. He's going through some things. I wish you two were closer. Framed as concern, not pressure. But I could feel the shape of what it was. I said something I'd been practicing, more or less, without fully knowing I was practicing it. I said, Dad, I love Daniel and I want things to be okay between us. But I wasn't able to give him $8,000, and I'm not going to apologize for that. I also want to say, and I'm saying this as calmly as I can, that it was hard for me when you weren't at graduation. I know you had reasons, and I'm not saying it was simple, but it hurt. And then 6 weeks later, Daniel called me with that request, and I'd never even gotten a text from him that day. And I need you to understand where I'm standing. My father was quiet for a long time, and then he said, I know I've missed things, Lily. I know I haven't always gotten it right. That was all he said. He didn't explain or defend or pivot. He just said that. And I don't know exactly what to do with those words. I'm still figuring that out. They weren't an apology, not really, but they also weren't nothing. They were maybe the most honest thing he'd said to me in years, and I chose to hold them the way you hold something fragile, carefully without squeezing too hard. We ended that call more gently than I expected. Not resolved, nothing was resolved, but something had shifted slightly. A molecule of honesty had moved from one place to another, and in a family like mine, that's not nothing. Daniel and I haven't spoken since. I've thought about reaching out more than once. I've drafted texts that I didn't send. I'm not certain what the right thing is, and I've given myself permission to not be certain. I don't think family automatically earns trust, and I don't think blood obligates you to keep absorbing whatever is handed to you without ever asking for something different. But I also know that the door isn't locked. If he came back differently, not with a handout, not with a speech about family that only gets invoked when something is needed, I'd be willing to try again. I genuinely would. My mother threw me a small dinner. 8 people, good food, good wine. One of those simple evenings that turns out to be quietly perfect. She made the chocolate cake I've asked for every birthday since I was 7. Slightly different every year, but always with the exact same frosting, because the frosting is the point, she always says. We sat around her living room afterward and told stories and laughed at the wrong things, and I looked around at those 8 people, my mother, my 2 best friends, a colleague I'd grown close to at work, a few others, and I thought, this is the family I built. This is the one that showed up. There's a thing that happens when you stop performing okayness and start actually living it. The spaces that used to be taken up by the anxiety of managing other people's feelings, of being small enough, quiet enough, not too much neat enough, those spaces open up, and you can fill them with things that are actually yours. Your own work, your own friendships, your own voice. I'm still in that process. I think it's a lifelong process, honestly. I don't believe in the version of healing where you get to a point and you're done and everything is clean and put away. I think it's more like tending something. You keep at it, you pay attention, you adjust. What I know right now is this: I have a job that means something to me. I have people in my life who would drive 2 hours in the rain to sit in a folding chair for me. I have a mother who shows up in yellow. I have a journal full of 11 o'clock honesty and a diploma on my wall and a set of professional standards I worked hard to earn, and a very clear sense of what I will and will not do with the money I've built from the ground up. I didn't give Daniel the $8,000. I didn't apologize to my father for having feelings about graduation. And I am, in spite of everything, genuinely okay. Not the kind of okay that's a placeholder for something worse. The kind that's a little tired and a little complicated and not finished yet, but actual. I walked across that stage without him in the crowd, and the diploma was still real. The moment was still real. The 4 years were still real. Nobody's absence gets to unmake what I built, and nobody's handout gets to reach into what I built and take from it either. That's what I learned in the end from the worst 6 weeks of an otherwise good year. That the boundaries you hold for yourself aren't walls. They're the edges of the life you've actually chosen. And when you stop apologizing for where those edges are, something loosens, something you didn't even realize was tight. I still think about that graduation night sometimes. The yellow dress, the flowers on the table, the toast that made me cry, the text at 9:47. I think about all of it. And then I think about the diploma on my wall, and the work I went to this morning, and the call I have scheduled with my mother tonight just because we like to talk on Tuesdays, and I think I'm going to be just fine. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. I love knowing where my listeners are finding these stories. If someone who missed your most important day asked you for a life-changing favor just weeks later, what would you do? Would you say yes, or would you protect yourself? If Lily's story hit something real in you today, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. New stories land every week on Lily Calm Stories, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.